pleased to be here. I was a guest editor of a special issue for the Open Access Historica journal, focusing on the environmental history of East Central Europe. The special issue contained 6 papers altogether. And out of the 6 papers, we have a number of contributors present, and we will discuss the main questions that were tackled in this special issue. We have a special guest here who will chair the session. Luminita Gatejel is a senior researcher at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg. She received her PhD from the University of Tübingen in 2010 and was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She has published extensively on the history of automobility and consumption in the Eastern Bloc. Her latest book is Engineering the Lower Danube, Technology and International Cooperation in an Imperial Borderland, was published by Central European University Press in 2022. So Luminita, I hand now the baton over to you, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation. It was a great pleasure to read all your text, and some of you I knew, and most of you I didn't. So it's a pleasure to see you all and to discuss with you within the next hours issues that pertain to this special issue. I think for the choreography, I will briefly introduce all the participants in no particular order. And then I will hand out the 3 questions that we prepared for this. And then each of the participants will have a chance for a brief answer. And then we'll take this as an opportunity to open up the discussion and also make it more interactive. We have one attendant, maybe more will join us. If not, we will have fun just between us. So since Victor introduced me, it's also a great pleasure to introduce him, well known in the field of environmental history, an environmental historian in this very interdisciplinary issue. His position is as an associate professor at the University of Tampere and at the University of Ostrava. And a visiting researcher at the University of Helsinki. I know him because I wrote a review of his book, which came out 2017 at Palgrave Macmillan, Technology and the Environment in State Socialist Hungary. And I think we all know his 2 very recent, fresh off the press articles in environmental history on paper waste and recycling in Hungary, but also the one also from 23, Environment and History, Socialist Environmentalism, Scientists and Environmental Change in Hungary. It's also my great pleasure to introduce Janja Sedlacek as an assistant at the Institute for Contemporary History in Ljubljana, Slovenia. She's part of a research group for Slovene social, economic, and environmental history. Her focus is on various themes, but they all come together and connect to the economic history of the 20th century, also dealing with environmental issues. Robert Balog is a research fellow at the Institute for Central European Studies at the Ludovica University of Public Service in Budapest. He is a historian focusing on the environmental history of Hungary through the lens of forestry, milk economy, and energy history in both rural and urban contexts. And he uses the Anthropocene epoch as a framework for his research. Ferenc Janko is a human geographer, again, underlining the interdisciplinary of this issue, as his position is as an associate professor at the Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, but also at the University of Sopron His main field of research is climate change and environmental controversy, past and present, climate change adaptation, and the history of geographical knowledge with a special focus on the Burgenland in Austria. And last but not least, Peter Homer, who is an archivist at the University in Győr, exactly, the István Széchenyi University that I also know from my historical research. So without further ado, I would read out the question that we collected. The first question deals with the concept of environmentalism and whether it is appropriate to use this concept for East Central Europe. And if it is, then does it have different meanings other than or when you want to compare it with North America and Western Europe? So it's more a question of how you personally define environmentalism and how you use it in your research. The second deals with issues of specificity for the area, for East Central Europe that we all are studying. So is there an East Central European or Eastern European environmentalism? And if so, does it have different priorities than so-called customary environmentalism? And what are those priorities? And the last question deals with when you look at your specific case studies, what does it mean when nature becomes a resource, and what actors, knowledge, networks were involved in this process? So we haven't worked out a particular order, so who feels brave enough to start? I leave it up to you. Thank you.
Maybe I can start. I would argue that, based on my readings and my research, of course, geographical knowledge was mentioned in my bio, and it is a related concept to environmental knowledge, I think. And there are many studies that highlight the special characteristic of geographical knowledge, and it means that our knowledges might have different meanings in different places. So I would argue that environmentalism might mean different things in different places relatedly. So we have different stories, we have different cases. However, on the other hand, we have readings, we've learned, the contemporaries read the newspapers, the knowledge is circulating around the world. So I think most of the countries are in connection with each other. Knowledge is a universal thing. So Eastern European environmentalism couldn't develop independently, I would say. So, however, we have different contexts, we have different political atmosphere, political context, historical context. So I think it's a bit too oversimplifying to say that when Western environmentalism and Eastern environmentalism, I would say that there are more environmentalism beyond these two. That's my argument. You can challenge or oppose.
Is it okay if I follow up on that? Yeah, and I just take the first one now, okay? So because we have time, so we can discuss the other two maybe a little bit later. So I agree with Ferenc. So there's not gonna be a lot of challenging over here, but maybe a little bit, just like seeing things from a different perspective, or seeing things in a different light, maybe the same things, just in a different light. I agree very much that I think environmentalism means different things in different time periods and different geographical locations and political systems and societies and so forth. And I think those are the differences that probably interest us as well. That's why we do this sort of a research, what we do, because we want to identify those similarities and differences oftentimes, and we are surprised by those similarities and differences, or we already know that what we would find anyway, because we already have some sort of an understanding of the historical era and the political system. And what I think that is important in my particular field of research is the role of the state, because in the historical context and the geographical context of East Central Europe, the role of the state has been very robust. It's a very complex. You cannot identify the state as a single actor, because within the state there is various lobby groups, there is various actor groups, there is various networks, and there is competition, there is collaboration. But when you kind of frame all these actors and all these networks and all these institutions and individuals as part of the state in the 20th century, especially in the state socialist period, but even before that, the role of the state is it's extremely robust. It's probably the most important part, I think, in my research to understand individuals and institutions who are acting within the state, within the limit, not the limit, that's not the right word, within the sway of the state. So if I had to highlight just one important thing, and that a little bit connects to the next question, but there is more to the next one, I think. Why East Central European environmental history and environmentalisms, and in the Eastern European environmentalisms are different from the West, let's say North America. I think it's the role of the state that could be perhaps the one pinpoint that I go back to all the time. Thank you.
Well, if I can proceed, I would like to pick up when you ended, Victor. When I was thinking about those questions, of course, the role of the state is what comes to my mind. But another thing that I think we have to stress is that sometimes in state socialist countries, there were just individuals that had so much power that could do lots of things if they were on the right place, if they were with the right connections, probably in Slovenia, in Yugoslavia in the 80s, it was not even that important anymore to be the part of the Communist Party. You could do some things, although you would not be in the party, but before, of course. There's an example in Sarajevo, which is really, really interesting. Emmerich Blum was a general director of one of the largest energetic companies in Yugoslavia, Energo Invest. And he played a crucial role with abating air pollution in Sarajevo, because he was aware of the environmental problems. He had that environmental sensitivity, and he also had the power. He was within the system, and he helped Sarajevo to get funds from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and they did construct a pipeline, and which was really important for the cleaner air in Sarajevo. So this is one thing that he was part of the system. Of course, he was part of the system, but still his environmental awareness was standing out. So I would say in a way, he was also searching for new ways, for new paths. And, you know, that's maybe one thing that I would like to stress also, the importance of the individuals, of course, the system, of course, the scientists, which were leading the path, at least in Yugoslavia, in 1960s, 1970s. And the difference probably between state socialist countries and the Western countries at that time, of course, was that although in Yugoslavia since 1960s there were lots of connections, scientific connections with the West, there was still this gap when the environmental issues were brought to the public light. I think it happened quite a bit later, because in the 1970s, there were just a few articles in the newspapers, in, let's say, in a magazine, which was not a scientific, but committed to larger circles, but still not a main newspaper about pollution. And it took some time then after that, until 1980s, when the environmental problems came to the fore in general public. So that's another thing that I would like to address, yeah, for now.
So I think we are left with Peter as the last round. Are we? Do you hear us? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, in our paper, we try to look at the relationship between knowledge circulation and regional level politics, national level politics, actually, and try to see what's the role of key sites in Central Europe that produce knowledge in the global circulation. So since we were talking about forestry, how forestry knowledge evolved in the early 19th century and how it became a political factor in the second half of the 19th century in Hungary. We didn't cross the border. We didn't go beyond 1945. So maybe that's here we can actually split the argument into two. Look at before what happens in this regard before 1945 and what happens after. So if you have to talk about 19th century and early 20th century developments, then it's certainly that Central Europe was actually one of the hubs of knowledge production. Forestry knowledge was a German product for much of the 19th century, and then it started to circulate globally, mostly because German foresters went to colonial empires like the Dutch Empire and to British India and to other parts of the world. And of course, they traveled to US as well. They started working in the US as well. So basically, this whole knowledge production became a global thing by the middle of the 19th century. And then it was this global knowledge was received again back to Europe and back to Hungary as well in specific contexts. For the Hungarian context, the most important was nation building, nationalism. So forestry as a profession became one of the constituents of nation building and of state building at the same time in the second part of the 19th century, especially after the compromise between Austria and Hungary. which meant a new political framework. So it's a kind of complex story, and I agree that, of course, we cannot really separate fully. You know, like Hungarian environmental thinking could not have developed independently, but at the same time, it had very specific characteristics. The language the role of language was very specific. For example, in nationalist politics, as we know. And we could also show it for forestry. So there were very specific things which couldn't have been, for example, in the US. They couldn't have happened in the US. And just very briefly, if I want to talk about, you know, why is it different from 1945 and why it's important to talk separately about what happens after the Second World War. Like from my perspective, of course, because as we kind of see, is the time of great acceleration, not only of post-war, like not only of Cold War, but also of great acceleration in terms of climate change, in terms of biophysical and biochemical changes on Earth. So we have to look separately of what kind of role state socialist countries and Central European countries played in this great acceleration. And if you look at that, of course, we cannot avoid asking the question of, you know, how this kind of Soviet knowledge was specific and how it was received also in these countries. So, those issues, the latter issue, what happens after 1945, was not the issue of our research in this journal. So maybe it's for another round. And thank you. I don't know if Peter wants to add something.
No, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Can I connect to Robert's thoughts? Yeah, so to reference my paper published together with my colleague, with my PhD student in Historica special issue. So I think the stories I try we try to write from a point of view clearly indicate those characteristics what Robert mentioned. So I think Hungarian metallurgy in the 20th century showed a clear example that both Western and Soviet or Eastern knowledge was involved in the progress and development of the metallurgical science within the narrow circles of the Hungarian Institute of Metallurgy and metallurgical education at the universities and more broadly for the public audience. Even in the 50s, I think these kind of knowledges were somehow in opposition whether to use the Soviet or the Western knowledge on climate and related issues. And the other story we touched the story of the Bush or Gabčíkovo Nagymaros barrage system also shows how environmentalists on the Hungarian side used Western examples from rivers in Germany and elsewhere. I don't remember, I'm sorry. So to show how bad these developments could be and what kind of harms they could do for the environment or for the nature at the Danube or with the Danube and around the landscapes in the Szigetkőz region or in the Danube band close to Budapest. Thank you.
Sorry, can I add one more thing just very briefly? Yeah, if I can, just to mention that what we also found very interesting in forestry is that basically it carried the dichotomy from its birth, that it's it has to be both economically viable. It has to produce wealth, basically, for the owners of the forest, or for the state, for that matter. And at the same time, foresters were very aware that it's a kind of vulnerable biological system that they are dealing with, so that we always have to protect forests. So it's kind of it's a great. I find forest is a great field of researching this question of environmental thinking, because it always carries this this paradox that we have to produce wealth and we have to protect nature as well at the same time. So just that's the note I wanted to make.
Yeah, if I can jump in. Of course, this was, I think we all agree, this was the one of the basic characteristics of the after the Second World War of the authorities, because of course industrial development was something that they were not ready to make compromises on that field. But what I found even more interesting was that in one report that they produced in Yugoslav Academy of Sciences and Arts already in the 1960s. They stressed out for the World Health Organization. They stressed out that under certain circumstances, when the to make this clearer, they basically said that Yugoslavia is still developing, and in that circumstances, it is probably best to just let these environmental issues be, although they knew that pollution was harmful for public health. But they said that it's probably best to let it be for a certain period of time, to get all the benefits of the industrialization. And then since a certain time, they would refer to environmentalism and to protection of the environment. That's what I found really, really interesting. And it says a lot about the relationship to the environmental issues from the not directly from the authorities, as those were the scientists, but it shows kind of a the world that they were thinking in.
Yeah, if I can respond now, there's a lot of things to respond to, so I will take maybe more than just a couple of minutes. What I found, I still remember the moment. It was 2006, I think. I started to work on my dissertation, and just like, gathering literature. So I went to the library, and it was a big library, and you could loan a lot of books, up to 200. So I loaned dozens of books about environmentalism, written mostly in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. I mean, this was 2006, so I couldn't loan any book that was published in 2010 or later. And when I was reading those books, I realized that okay, these authors were social scientists most of the time. In 2000, maybe some historians already, but mostly in the 80s, 90s, mostly political scientists and sociologists and international relations scholars. So what they were looking for in the East Bloc when they could access the East Bloc finally in the late 80s and early 90s, they were looking for kind of a mirror image of a Western type of civic engagement, especially in the 80s. It's a big moment for the Green movement in the West. And what they found, surprise, surprise, that civic societies in the East were inferior. What they felt that these societies were inferior. They lacked in the development of Western civic society. They were weaker. They had less leverage, less power, less space to navigate. And then the state itself and its various institutions, they wanted to curtail, or they had the aim to curtail environmental activism in Eastern European countries. But the mighty people fought back, and they were so numerous and so strong together that environmentalism was one of the key issues, the key themes in the late 80s and early 1990s that brought down the Soviet Union and the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. And so when I was reading these books, I felt something was a little bit odd, something was a little bit off. But I was young and, just a PhD student, probably not even admitted to a program, just like reading to draft a research proposal. And it was a year later when someone asked me, have you read this book by Zsuzsa Gile? Probably the person didn't know I was Hungarian as well. And I was like, no, I've never heard of that book. So I read the first few pages and I was like, yeah, exactly. This is it. This is what I kind of felt that was off. Because when you look into you're searching for a mirror image of something that is existing somewhere, and you want to identify the same thing in a different society, a different political system, different cultural systems, then you will not find the same thing. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? And so Zsuzsa Gile identified this issue that when you are trying to imprint Western environmentalism in an Eastern European context, it doesn't work because it's a different context. It's so simple. It's that simple. I mean, it's not completely different. It was not developed in isolation, obviously. It was not developed in Mars or Jupiter. It was developed on this globe with influences from various places, but it's not the same thing. And so I think that was very, very influential to me when I was looking for how to interpret what the environment meant to society and politics. And I'm halfway already, so the other half is coming. And so I've been working mostly on state socialism for my PhD, but after my PhD, I ventured into the 19th century and early 20th century, which was very hard. 19th century, not so much, because, I could dig into people like István Széchenyi. I like the guy. I find him very inspiring. And some other scientists that I had already known about a little bit. And the scientific discussions I had been a little bit familiar with anyway. But the interwar era was very difficult, very hard for me. I didn't know much about it. And it's kind of like my mental idea, like imprint, was that it's so different from state socialism. And no, in many ways, the scientific discussions I found, especially in the interwar era, they were, yes, very different, super different, but at the same time, the dynamics are kind of similar. So I think in the East Central European context, you see a very strong influx of ideas, especially technocratic, technological ideas from the West. Even in socialism, interwar era, yes, 19th century, it's a Western type of modernization process. So you see, when it's hydrology, it's the Dutch when it's other sort of, forestry, as the Germans, as Robert mentioned. However, you have these alternative ideas that maybe not the mainstream, but they kind of, cross-pollinate these Western ideas, and then result in a mix of thoughts and beliefs and scientific theses that are area specific. And in the Hungarian context, this was this tyrannic link in the interwar era. Ferenc knows, I think Ferenc, I suppose you know a lot about this. And so I'm not claiming that the tyrannic idea, so the brotherhood between the non-Indo-European nations, the Hungarians, the Central Asians, Siberians, was the most important scientific school of thought in interwar Hungary. This is not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that there is this alternative way of looking into hydrology, looking into landscape planning that has an impact on the discourse as a whole. And it is interesting what Robert also mentioned, that the Soviet ideas, they were implemented in Hungary, maybe not immediately, not like, in a snapshot. It took some time, took a whole generation to change. But maybe that generation and the generation prior to that generation was already prepared to understand ideas that are kind of off compared with Western environmentalisms. And what puts these things into the same bracket or the same basket for me, the Turanist ideas in the interwar era. Oh, and then 19th century, we can think about 19th century like alternative scientific ideas, and then Soviet holism or Soviet scientific environmentalism after 1945 or 1948 rather. It's the different view, the more holistic view over the environment, the way they see humans as part of the environment. At least that's the philosophy behind it, that's the ideology behind it, and how to negotiate what Janja said, how to negotiate societal needs, the socialist idea of progress and technological progression, with preserving these resources that are very important for us, because we are socialist or we are nationalist. It's funny, it's two very different perspectives, but in a way, comparable approaches to the environment. We need to develop because we want to be the best nation, or we need to develop because we are communist, we are better than the capitalist, but we also want to preserve our natural environment better because we are nationalists in the interwar era, or because we are communist, because we do this, even this we do better than the capitalists, preserving our environment.
So just if I can add one more notion here, is like which really connects to what Victor has said, is for interwar area, not only the notion of course, there was this tyrannic school of thought, but also the idea of the Carpathian Basin was very strong, and it influenced thinking in both forestry and hydrology. So this notion that the Hungarian nation should exist within the boundaries of the Carpathians, and that there is a Carpathian Basin which forms a kind of natural area for anything to work, be it society or river systems or forest. That was also very strong. That had also a very strong influence on both the mainstream thinking, like engineers, and the public and the politicians, of course, through media channels and public discourse. So that's what I wanted to just add.
If I may, just listening to you is a great pleasure. I think I just as a way of summing up a few loose ideas, I very much would subscribe to what Victor said, with this strong influence of the state as a possible characteristic, and also a longue durée characteristic of what makes a certain specificity of Central Europe or Southeastern Europe, if we want to be broader. I think there've been a few other research. I was just thinking of the recent volume of Stéphane Dorondel and Stella Sherban. They also focus on this primate of the state and how this state. And I also would very much subscribe to this, to look at in the longer perspective, but also not so much. I mean, sure, there are differences, and 1945 or 48 would be such a rupture because of the great accelerations, but still there are underlying continuities. They are under not only in practices, but also in ideas and also networks that were not destroyed by the two blocks. And I think that's also something that we still should work more on this. The other question that I had while listening to you and also reading the papers and that just came to me is, if we look at the methodologies that historians use, but apparently also geographers and some others, is and some of you worked very closely with biographies and putting individual. It's something also what Diana said now in the discussion, that there were these powerful actors that did things and they could do things. On the other hand, there might be also some limitation to this biographical approach. Like in the sense that what would be the larger societal implications. So how would you, on this more theoretical level, approach this? So certainly there are quite a few things one could find out by following these actors, but what is also remains hidden when we just look at these actors.
Our answer was because, of course, forestry is also one of the fields where big personalities seem to dominate the discourse, at least like the memory of contemporary foresters, of what was happening before. So our approach was basically to try to place a professional group as a whole within the political system and within society. And also began, it's only the first phase, but to begin to understand the social position of those who become part of this group, this quite large professional group, which had a large impact on landscape change activities, anthropogenic landscape change in both 19th and 20th century. So maybe this approach, taking professional groups together and looking at them from a social history perspective also could be one of the ways to make better use of biographies. But I think Peter has really a lot on that, because he's the one who is thinking a lot about this question.
Well, I've mentioned an individual only to addition to what I think is the main things, because I think we should not forget about them. But of course, those conceptual landscapes are made of different kind of actors, from authorities to environmentalists, forming environmental movement. I'm only now in the second half of the 20th century, of course. Scientists, people in general, who have become more and more aware about the environmental issues, and all that, of course, somehow generates this conceptual landscape of ideas that then are just the ground change something or to make environmental policy work, or to make environmental action of environmentalists be successful. So yeah, it was only I thought that I think that we may not forget that sometimes the individuals in those systems can do big changes.
Is it okay if I follow up? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the role of the individuals is very important when it comes to so my primary intention was to voice the ethnic communities in Hungary and their environmental relationships. And so when I was reading Hungarian-speaking scientists writing about the ethnic communities, I was reading primarily not to understand what that Hungarian-speaking scientist was writing, or why. It's usually he, always exclusively he, writing about those ethnic communities, but I wanted to trace the history of these ethnic communities, the environmental history, because of my family's history. And what I found was troubling, really embarrassing. Of course, I'm a historian. Many of us are historians, so we should not transport our current standards to 19th century. That would be ahistorical, but just reading about communities like my own via the lens of accomplished scientists who are writing, even with that filter, you know, like you think about 19th century, okay, they were racist and xenophobes and all that, all of them. They were thinking about in terms of civilized, non-civilized, you know, all these terms. But it's troubling because it's my personal history, you know, you cannot really like detach. They're writing about practically people like my ancestors, you know. And so so I think what differentiated these prominent scientists from the people that they were writing about was the power of their voices. They had the connections, they were embedded in the political system. Oftentimes they were scientists, but they also would be in various political positions, or they would have political connections. And so I think that is a big difference. And you see, the Hungarian case is funny because you see in 1920, a big change, you know, huge drama unfolds. And from, I don't like the word oppressor, because already in the 19th century, you feel that these scientists are speaking from a position of being threatened. They're growing aggressive and militant by the end of the 19th century in their language, in their arguments, because it's a minority, basically. It's a politically dominant but minority within the country. And after 1920, what you see with the new political boundaries, that the self-victimization is changing the discourses. So those communities that were targeted as anti-Hungarian, alien agents working for alien interests within our country, suddenly those became very important and somehow to be won over, as Robert mentioned, that the concept of the Carpathian Basin and the idea of the nation. So after 1920, it was not even a problem if someone didn't speak Hungarian anymore, because it was the place that supposedly molded these peoples into one culture group or whatever, a multi-ethnic culture group that was to be Hungarian, according to many scientists. So yeah, it was ridiculous on the one hand to see these discussions changing and reflecting to the political situation, but also see that when you have power and when your voice has power, how can you use that voice, to what end you're using that voice? And I think that story is really speaking to our age today. And I'm very happy that one part of the story will be published next year in March, I think, or February. And I hope that the other part will be published soon as well, because I think it's a very current issue.
Just mentioned, where will you publish it, if it's just coming soon?
Yes, the 19th century report will be published in Agriculture History in February, and the other half I don't know yet. It's in review, so we'll see. Yeah, it's already been rejected once. But it was a very prestigious American journal, so I understand their concern. It was not a global enough story, so it's fine.
Yeah, I don't know if I may add one thing, because I mean, we coming to the resources question also, that it's also a global story. Like one of the main stories, besides nation building and state building, which is of course relevant in our region, one of the other stories which we need to take in mind is the growth of capitalist profit-oriented agriculture, which kind of determines or drives anthropogenic landscape change activities, also designed by engineers, by state, by whoever. And this kind of other movement, or this other objective had an impact on the ground, and had a large impact on how people actually living in the villages carried out their economic activities. And also this has a kind of a subaltern element to it, because this profit-oriented agriculture meant an end break for a lot of the commons that were still in place in the 19th century. Of course, this kind of enclosure, which took place after 1848, was a long process that lasted 4 decades, but also impacted the way Hungarian, in our case, or any kind of state authorities interacted with the local communities. And of course, it also means that they interacted with various ethnic groups. So that Hungarian-speaking administrators interacted with many ethnic groups, also in cases of this enclosure process, which I think is the key to understand how nature was turned into resource, which was the other question that Luminita has raised.
Is there anybody else who wants to add something else, maybe completely different or connected to the things that just had been said?
Yeah, maybe one thought. Yeah, I think this story is maybe twofold. So I think nature as a resource, as a dominant idea, many times was up, but sometimes down. So utilitarian view on nature, I think it's much more older than the 20th or the 19th century. According to my reading in the first geographical descriptions of Hungary, I tried to browse once. So they told me that utilitarian view was very common among people before the rise of capitalism. Of course, aesthetic views on nature other types of views were also present, but it depends, I think, on the historical context. What discourse could take the dominance, or can take even in the present. So it is always, I think, somehow competition of different discourses, different environmental discourses. And this competition, the current state of the actors, always somehow result in an environmental policy, in policy of nature conservation and related things. So I think this story is interesting to unfold, always for us to understand what are the present factors, the underlying things, what influence all these stories in a given situation, in forestry, in different industrial sectors, or in hydrology. So it is an interesting for us, and I think it is there are a lot of things to research in this. Thank you.
There may be a time for a short sum up, or I don't want to, it is a lively discussion, so I don't want to, so maybe just not being exclusive, and thank you very much. I learned a lot. It was again a great pleasure reading your article and the special issue as a whole. I would like just to make 4 points that the issues that we discussed today was the role of the state, and to look more closely at the specificities of the state. I think the sun is coming up here in Regensburg, which is a good sign. The role also, in connection to this, discussing the role of powerful stakeholders and their role in this state system, but not only. I think the other issue that we talked about, and I think that's also very important, to look for alternative ways or alternative versions, or even complete alternatives to the Western modernity, and how they interacted with global ideas on environmentalism. And last but not least, this is how markets beyond capitalism, but also specifically capitalism, shaped our understanding of resources, of a utilitarian view of nature. And I think what I've been hearing also quite a lot is that we should, take the longer view, leave state socialism and look at least to the 19th century. But if we want to follow the geographers, maybe just to take a proper longue durée and even look, beyond modernity and what, still is, discussed and is part of this what we sometimes in a shorthand consider as very specifically modern, but maybe it's not that modern and that specific at all. Without wanting to be, comprehensive, just, things that we probably will keep on researching and thinking about and talking about. If I forgot something important, then now is the time to say,
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoyed very much our discussions, and I hope they will be continued in other venues and other formats. And I know I'm going to see Janja soon in a couple of weeks. So, and I hope I see Luminita and Robert and Ferenc as well soon in the future. And I hope I will meet Peter in person at some point.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I also enjoyed.
Thank you.
From me also.